Bobby Western getting mad at his dad for creating the atomic bomb be like,
you doomed the human race and you don't feel responsible for building a lifeboat, for saving us, for like, what kind of a sociopath are you?
Yeah, there's a famous story of this guy who had a pet chimp. And then the thing about chimps is you can keep them when they're young and then they get older and it's like a man, but a man that's 5 times stronger than you. And like, why is he going to listen to you? So this guy goes to visit the chimp and he brings a birthday cake. Happy birthday, buddy. And the other chimps, they're in cages right next to it, are like, this motherfucker didn't bring me a cake? I can't believe this shit. So they figure out a way to get out. And they got out and they attacked the man and they tore him apart. They tore his face off, they tore his dick off, they tore his feet off.
I can't remember which American writer it was. I heard him speak and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable.
hello everyone, my name is Nate Rankin, owner, proprietor, esquire, and 6th man of the year of the channel you know and love. It's books you haven't read. Welcome aboard, welcome back. Today I am going to be talking about the 2 new novels by Cormac McCarthy, new as of a couple months ago, The Passenger and Stella MARIS. And in classic books you haven't read style, I am going to talk about the titles first. So starting off with The Passenger. The Passenger refers to the missing passenger of a downed airplane in the Gulf of Mexico that protagonist Bobby Western and his salvage diving crew are investigating upon the opening of the book. But it is used in a more general sense. If we are meant to see Bobby as a passenger, which I think it's fairly obvious that we are, then we understand his journey to be something that is outside of his control. And this is strongly reinforced throughout the book and is obviously a flip side of Bobby's career as a race car driver, passenger. And maybe an overly reductive way to view his race car career is to view it as his failed and doomed attempt to take control of his life. As for Stella MARIS, that is the name of the hospital or institution asylum that Sister Alice checks into. It translates to Star of the Sea and is closely associated with the Virgin Mary, obviously refers to the Northern Star or Polaris. There's also a constant theme of the sea and of drowning in both of these books. In fact, it's Bobby's greatest fear. His greatest fear is depths as opposed to heights. And so amidst his drowning, you could say that his sister is kind of his Northern Star. I want to talk briefly about the plot, and then I'll get into kind of the main thing that I want to talk about in this video, or I guess the plots of the 2 interconnected books. So these books are about Bobby and Alice Western. Alice is later self-styled to Alicia. They are both geniuses, Bobby in physics and Alicia in mathematics. They're named Bob and Alice because their physicist dad, who worked on the atomic bomb at Los Alamos, that was kind of his cheeky joke, that Bob and Alice are common names to use in like hypotheticals or thought experiments that physicists tend to use. So like, Bob and Alice were walking through the forest one day when ... The Passenger takes place in 1980 and concerns older brother Bobby. Stella MARIS takes place in 1972, during Alicia's last days before she commits suicide. Her death casts an obvious pall over the 2 books. In fact, the first scene in The Passenger is Alicia's death scene. Stella MARIS, on the other hand, is an all-dialogue book. It's a series of conversations that Alicia has with her therapist, and they're very intellectual in nature, and they heavily concern mathematics and philosophy and ontology and the nature of knowledge, you know, really deep and elemental conversations. The Passenger opens up after the death of Alicia. We go to a scene of a salvage diving crew who's investigating a downed plane. There's a missing passenger on board, as well as a pilot's bag and a black box, and there's no obvious clear sign of exit or escape. This event then kind of sets everything else in motion, and thereafter you might call this novel one of great itinerancy. Bobby is visited by some feds soon after who ask him some questions about the plane. At another point he he comes back to his place and discovers that his his apartment has been ransacked through, whether by the feds or someone worse. And if you know anything about America and small planes going down over the Gulf of Mexico in the 1980s, I'm sure you can imagine. The IRS seizes his bank account along with his race car. He was a race car driver in Europe, and a crash put him in a coma just before the events of Stella MARIS. And so throughout Stella MARIS, Alicia presumes him to be dead. But The Passenger is a very paranoid book. It crosses over into a lot of territory that, you know, a DeLillo head like me absolutely adores, whether that's paranoia, the bomb. We even get a ranting JFK conspiracy theory there at the end. Bobby is all the meanwhile haunted by the death of his sister, a fellow genius smarter than him, and the tragic, unconsummated romantic love they have for each other. He is equally haunted by his father's helping hand in the creation of the atomic bomb and all of the perversion of genius that entails. Genius is a very important part in these two books, which of course kind of has its own meta-significance coming from a man who was one of the first recipients of the MacArthur Genius Grant. It's very articulate on mathematics, physics, the nature of knowledge, and it retains, as ever, that classic McCarthy vibes. So the main thing that I want to talk about in this video is the theme of Gnosticism in these two books. Gnosticism is a very common theme throughout a lot of McCarthy. I remember being first introduced to it in college. There's a great article somewhere on the Gnostic themes in Blood Meridian, and that gave me a really fertile kind of intellectual foundation because I hadn't read Blood Meridian to that point, wouldn't read it until after I got out of college. But ever since then, I've always noticed these themes come up again and again in McCarthy's works. So I'm going to focus on two words today that relate to Gnosticism. The first one is Demiurge. So the Demiurge is the creator god who is effectively Satan. In the cosmology of Gnosticism, you know, they have kind of the same basic Christian stories, but the mythological underpinnings are different. So in the cosmology of Gnosticism, the Demiurge is like the asexual reproduction of like a runt angel. And the runt angel's name is Sophia. Anyway, so the Demiurge, the Satan of the character, is the creator of the physical world, okay? God himself is separated from the physical nature of man. He is outside of that world and does not have direct contact, though he can send, you know, like a son of his own, like Jesus Christ. But that's the only way that he kind of has contact. And that separation of physical world and heavenly world is really important in kind of the overall mythology of Gnosticism. And so because the Demiurge made the physical world, it is made, you know, in his image. And for that reason, the world is generally seen as hostile or malevolent or downright evil. In McCarthy's works, because this is a general theme across his oeuvre, you tend to see hostile weather. We get a good chunk of that in this book, particularly towards the end with all the kind of magnificent storms that are happening just off the coast of the part of Spain that Bobby has run off to. In Blood Meridian, it's rendered much more starkly or prominently while, you know, kind of talking particularly about the landscape, almost characterizing it as, you know, another antagonist in the novel. But I bring this up because I think more than anything, this is where like McCarthy's bleakness comes from. Much is made in Gnosticism about the transience of the world, the transient nature of the physical world, whereas, you know, in like the original religious context, that's a really optimistic thing, right? Because that's part and parcel of dying. You leave the physical world, this passing, fading physical world, and ascend into the eternal spiritual ever after. But in McCarthy's case, there is no hope or faith or, you know, the idea of an afterlife. Certainly not among the vast majority of his characters. It's just sort of a brutal fact that they contend with. McCarthy, like a lot of his contemporaries, you know, I'm thinking Pynchon, chief among them, chooses to write more about the preterite than the elect. The second word I want to talk about is the word gnosis, and this is where, Gnostic comes from. Gnosis just means knowledge or enlightenment, usually a divine mystical enlightenment, and this is the fundamental principle, right, of kind of Gnostic Christianity. The thing that all men are trying to move toward is trying to achieve gnosis, trying to achieve enlightenment. Obviously has a lot of superficial connections with like Buddhism and enlightenment in that sense. You save yourself by recognizing the divinity of God within you. That's sort of your unlocking out of the matrix part. This book has, knowledge and attempts to achieve knowledge and attempts to achieve enlightenment of one kind or another all over it. The best minds of Bobby's father's generation are brought together and they create the atomic bomb. So it's kind of fundamentally about a perversion of enlightenment. These scientists, they create a thing that can and does level two different cities, and I thought that this comes from page 117. The way that McCarthy renders this in this passage is so powerful and so unique. There were people who escaped from Hiroshima and rushed to Nagasaki to see their loved ones were safe, arriving just in time to be incinerated. He went there after the war with a team of scientists, my father. He said that everything was rusty. Everything looked covered with rust. There were burnt-out shells of trolley cars standing in the streets. The glass melted out of the sashes and pooled on the bricks. Seated on the blackened springs, the charred skeletons of the passengers with their clothes and hair gone and their bones hung with blackened strips of flesh. Their eyes boiled from their sockets, lips and noses burned away. Sitting in their seats laughing. The living walked about, but there was no place to go. They waded by the thousands into the river and died there. They were like insects in that no one direction was preferable to another. Burning people crawled among the corpses like some horror in a vast crematorium. They simply thought that the world had ended. It hardly even occurred to them that it had anything to do with the war. They carried their skin bundled up in their arms before them like wash that it not drag in the rubble and ash, and they passed one another mindlessly on their mindless journeyings over the smoking afterground, the sighted no better served than the blind. The news of all this did not even leave the city for 2 days. Those who survived would often remember these horrors with a certain aesthetic to them. In that mycoidal phantom blooming in the dawn like an evil lotus, and in the melting of solids not heretofore known to do so, stood a truth that would silence poetry 1,000 years. Like an immense bladder, they would say, like some sea thing, wobbling slightly on the near horizon. Then the unspeakable noise. They saw birds in the dawn sky ignite and explode soundlessly and fall in long arcs earthward like burning party favors. That passage has just stuck with me. A lot of the passages in this book has stuck with me as being something or being rendered in a way that only McCarthy can write, that only McCarthy can create. He has that, staccato Baroque vocabulary and rhythm to his sentences. And I think that scene in particular is so important that it really requires a unique language. And I thought that was done especially effectively here. But as I mentioned, there is this kind of theme of rejection of gnosis. I believe that it's the character Euler, which is a homonym for the mathematician, E-U-L-E-R, by the way. He says in response to finding the plane at the beginning, that basically he gets spooked out by it. He says, effectively, that I don't ask questions whose answers I know are going to lead me to trouble. It's basically my religion, I think he says. And Bobby himself absolutely subscribes to that, religion. His story, I think, is particularly marked by the rejection of gnosis and enlightenment, particularly after seeing his father achieve such ungodly destruction through sort of his achievement of gnosis. So some things that Bobby rejects. He rejects finding more out about the plane. That in fact, ends up being like a hanging parenthesis on the whole book. He rejects working in physics himself. He rejects, he got a degree from Caltech and ended up, like I said, becoming a race car driver and rejecting that path for him. And then I think most importantly, there's a very specific scene where he rejects knowledge to know more about Alicia. Alicia's principal hallucination, she herself is a schizophrenic. The hallucination is known as the thalidomide kid, and it's like a 3.5 foot tall guy with flippers. And he comes to Bobby at one point, kind of in a vision, and he offers to tell Bobby, or he says, go ahead and ask me whatever you want. And Bobby's like, I don't want to ask you anything. I'm rejecting knowing more about this. So he rejects knowing whatever is at the core, or according to this hallucination. He rejects whatever gnosis this hallucination is offering him. And so this all kind of came into place for me near the end of the book, and I'll read that last sentence. But where in the last sentence it uses a particular phrase. It calls Bobby the last pagan on Earth. And I'll flip there. Finally, he leaned and cupped his hand to the glass chimney and blew out the lamp and lay back in the dark. He knew that on the day of his death, he would see her face, and he could hope to carry that beauty into the darkness with him, the last pagan on earth, singing softly upon his palate in an unknown tongue. When I first read that, it tripped me up. I thought it was a little strange because I didn't necessarily see, as I have said previously, Bobby as being particularly pagan in relation to the rest of his world. Because I was thinking in like a really traditional, like Christian kind of piety sense. But especially as things kind of fell into place for me later, I realized that Bobby is rejecting a gnosis. He is a pagan of gnosis. And so in that sense, he is standing apart from the rest of the world that continues, to grow apace in our pursuit of all kinds of knowledge. And he himself has rejected that, and therefore he has become the pagan. And I thought that was a really, really great way to kind of tie that theme together and to really present it in the last sentence of the book. So I've been talking mostly about the passenger, but there's a lot of good stuff on this theme in Stella Maris too. Regarding the Demiurge, there is a scene, I believe, it's in the Judas hole scene, which this is the first time I've ever heard of the term Judas hole, and I kind of love it. But in that scene, she's talking to her therapist about kind of seeing or being enlightened to this other world that is behind our world and that is controlled by a dark and malevolent force. And that was like kind of the thing that got me really thinking about Gnosticism, because that's such a clear invocation of the Demiurge and otherwise kind of, secular language. As for Gnosis and enlightenment, Alicia chases enlightenment or Gnosis through mathematics, but this ends up in failure for her, in disillusionment. Because of kind of the nature of what mathematics really is, or what she talks about is really, it really is. You can think of stuff like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and maybe just the tautological nature at the base of all numbers. So Alicia is, dealing with a kind of mathematical atheism, I think you could say. And she admits that she's working on a kind of math. It's called algebraic topology. I don't know what that is. And she at one point talks about how the foundation of this kind of math is very sketchy and unfounded by its kind of big founders and proponents. And that she knows, and she has come to understand, that there is not a whole to understand. There's not a complete thing and an entirely provable system that she can ultimately work towards. And she characterizes this all very matter-of-factly, but there is a strong sense of defeat in it for her. She has discovered not only that she will never be able to consummate her enlightenment in mathematics, but that she will also in a different scene, she will also be unable to consummate her romantic love for her brother, who, at one point, she confesses to and, tells him that she wants to have his baby. And he, of course, rejects her, and he can't, it freaks him out. And then, of course, by the time of the present of this novel, she presumes him to be dead. She feels like she has gone past, that point of no return in both her, I guess you could say, professional or intellectual life, as well as her romantic life. And so when you kind of understand the weight of those two things, you understand exactly why she might feel so destitute and hopeless to kill herself. She has a great quip. She's a very quippy character, Alicia is. But I thought she had this great quip. Anyway, I'll read it and then I'll explain what I think it is. So, is God a mathematician? God can't add 2 and 2. 0 and 1 are all he's got to work with. The rest is us. And I thought that was a beautiful way to kind of put the concept of, math as a man-made object. There's this conversation over kind of, do numbers and math exist in like a platonically real sense, or is this something that is just kind of in humans' heads? And I thought that was a great way of maybe splitting the metaphors, of kind of meeting it in the middle, that there is a sort of natural binary, maybe God-made binary at the base of it all, but that everything else is something that man has done. That there's a foundation there, yes, maybe of something natural, something real, something on and off at the very least, if it's binary, but all the rest is us. Anyway, I just thought that was a very, kind of simple, almost folksy way of communicating this idea that rang very true to me. However, I am not a math guy. I'm a Cormac McCarthy reader. So those were kind of my main thoughts on this book. I was never going to be able to talk about this book in the time limit that I kind of set for myself with these videos. There have been many, many people who have done lots longer content. Obviously, Leaf by Leaf just put up like an 1.5-hour video or something. Shout out Drake, who put his out, I think a couple months ago now at this point. Shout out also to the podcasts whose names I can't remember, but you know who you are, you McCarthy podcast people. They're not watching this. But I thought that the Gnostic themes in particular might really help out readers who are maybe fascinated on kind of a surface level of this, but that sort of theoretical or mythological underpinning underneath it, I think really brings some value to reading these two books. And it also brings value if you're reading any other McCarthy as well. Again, particularly Blood Meridian. I'll try and include a link. I'll try to remember including a link to that article that I mentioned. Other than that, thank you for watching. Again, very impressive that you made it all the way through to the end. Bravo to you. I will be, taking a break. That's to be determined how long it will be. I might make some mixtapes in the interim, but nothing that's going to be me on camera, on screen. I'll be honest, this is the second, almost third time I've recorded this because the clips have been unsatisfactorily blurry in my previous attempts. Other than that, please tell me how you felt about this book, or tell me how your day's going. Bye!